So good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to today's book talk about Arthur Miller, American Witness. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you for joining us today virtually. We hope you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust, What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors, Faces of Life After the Holocaust, from photographer Martin Scholler, which is running through June 18th. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by John Lahr and John Guare. Guare, apologies. John Lahr has been a contributor to The New Yorker since 1991, where for 21 years he was its senior drama critic. He's the author of 18 books, including Tennessee Williams' Mad Pilgrimage of the Flesh, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. John Guare's plays include The House of Blue Leaves, A Free Man of Color, 6 Degrees of Separation, A Few Stout Individuals, and Landscape of the Body. You can buy Arthur Miller, American Witness at the link in the chat. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to John and John.
John.
Hey, Johnny.
How are you? Good to see you. Sydney, could I see John's face? I just see
I believe when he speaks, you'll be able to see his face.
Can you see me now, John?
I can see you now. Yes, that's
okay,
right. If it's a conversation, I'd like to see you. John, congrats on this book. I'm so glad. I'd love to talk to you about theater, and it's one of the, you have your life in London, and I'm here in New York, and I miss talking to you just about theater and what's going on and what's happening. And to me, your work on Tennessee Williams is that book. The Pilgrim of the Flesh is one of the great theater biographies.
Oh, bless you.
And so then I was very curious to see that you were going to do Arthur Miller, and then I read the book, and it was quite brief, which surprised me, and also. The thing that you did that surprised me is that you gave an image of Arthur Miller, not as a Lincoln-esque stern, Mount Rushmore, serious intellectual, but just as a guy. I got a feeling of him as a young man, an enthusiastic young man, lost, looking for an identity, only having seen 2 or 3 plays in his life. And becoming a playwright, and I wondered, how did you? And that picture of Arthur that you painted is closer to the Arthur I knew towards the end of it. We became friends at the end of his life, and I was always amazed at the lightness of Arthur and how cheery he was and how funny he was, and sort of zany and. I'd love you for capturing that. How did you address Arthur as a human being? How did you? Because there's a great progression in this book of a young man becoming the great man and then becoming a lost man.
Well, my GPS is always to start more or less with the family, because I sort of believe, and it's at least in my work in biography, that really the dialogue one is having through the plots of your stories, really you're talking to the ghosts of your past, your internalized people. And in Miller's case, his family is crucial to the plays he wrote because he was always writing one way or another about them in some way. And it's sort of important, I think. And so I approached it first by looking at and having the good fortune to know the son of Miller's brother Kermit, who gave me an insight into the family that just isn't in the books. But essentially, the important thing to know about, the first thing to know about Miller is that his father was not allowed to come with the family to America because the family thought he was slow. So and therefore
From where? Come from where?
From Poland to New York, and they didn't want to be turned away with this slow child.
How old was he?
Say again.
How old was the father when he was not taken, when he was rejected by his family? Was he a boy? He was 6. Oh, okay.
When he came, he was essentially orphaned. They left him with an uncle who died. They put a cardboard sign around his neck and said the name of the ship in Hamburg that he was meant to. They put him on a train, and he somehow got on that thing, got to America, and went almost immediately into the Lower East Side to Stanton Street and got into the rag trade. And he progressed. He as an adult, he was a handsome, strong, very and like Arthur, very sociable and affable and commanding in his own way. And by the age of 32, the American experiment really paid off for him, and he began as a salesman. But what Arthur says in his books is that his father was in the cloak trade. He doesn't say that his father ran a business of about 800 people, and it was one of the 2 or 3 biggest clothing manufacturer in America. So Arthur, when it's the average yearly wage in America around the time when Arthur was growing up was $680 a year. And a man called William Fox, who was a sponger in the trade, came to Isidore was his name, and asked him for a loan of $50,000 because he wanted to go into the movies. And Isidore refused him, and that 50,000 is the equivalent of our money of about $1 million. And it had he said yes, Arthur's life would have been completely different because that was 20th Century Fox. Anyway,
wow. So Arthur was a rich kid.
Very. He lived in Central Park North, just east of Fifth Avenue, on the 6th floor with maids, knabe, pianos. The father drove down to 23rd Street in a chauffeured car. And they had a bungalow in Far Rockaway for the summers. And when he decided to get married, Isidore decided to get married at the age of 32, his wedding had 250 people in it. So Arthur came into the world and lived and idealized his father, who enjoyed being, as he writes in Time Bends, the son of this big, powerful guy. But the real secret to the man, and the thing that sort of ultimately contaminated the marriage to a beautiful cum laude high school graduate who painted, read, sang, played the piano.
And was she the child of immigrants?
Yes, and also rich. It was a merger, and the thing that no one knew, she didn't know until after they were married, was that Isidore couldn't read or write.
What?
Yeah, He could not read or write. And that plays out in Arthur's life in an extraordinarily interesting way, because in the first instance, he idealized his father. And Arthur was, by his own admission, an absolutely terrible student. Terrible, right up through high school. I mean, really so bad that he couldn't, even in the Depression, he couldn't get into a college. he couldn't do it. But to go back to this, he was the middle son. Arthur was the middle son of three. Kermit was born in 1912, and his sister Joan was born in 1920. And the real star of the family was Kermit. Kermit was the student. He was handsome. He was the athlete, and he was, in a sense, the one who was going to carry on the family tradition, which looked very like some substantial legacy. And on the other hand, Miller wasn't the baby anymore. But there are lots of signs in Miller's story, which he doesn't always pick up in time beds. He was restless. He was a sleepwalker. He didn't feel, and he says this, he by the age of 6 or 7, he had his own psychic space. He didn't really feel comfortable in the family, and for this reason, essentially Isidore and his wife Gussie, or Augusta, had nothing in common. They had no frames of reference. He was a businessman who ran a big business, was very powerful, but had no cultural interests. And she was very culturally ambitious, and this was a real issue. And gradually, first, even before the Depression, there was a sort of drizzle of contempt at the father. And this is something that, I mean, I know this in my own life, but kids pick up on conscious things, and that really affected Miller, who didn't want to surpass his father, and at the same time, his mother, he didn't. If he sided with his mother, it would seem as a put down of the father, But this, in time, in actuality, and something that he dramatized in his first play, No Villain, he was the Oedipal struggle. He surpassed his father, and in his mother's eyes, he did that. Anyway, those are the sort of parameters of his life, that he, as he went into his teenage years. And when the other point I should make is, because of this tension in the family, he had a habit, even before he knew he was a writer, he had a fictionalizing habit of mind. He split his family. He had two stories about his mother, the loving mother and the mother who was trying to seduce him against the father, and the father who was this loving, big, powerful guy, and also a sort of ogre. All these things were going on in his consciousness. So that I think was really interesting. And when I got that set, I could sort of start to see, I sort of got a feeling of him and could see how these issues, which he subsequently dramatized in various ways, or admitted, should we say, in various ways through the stories, sort of began to sort of leach into his work, which was a long time away. He really didn't. It's interesting. He's not the first playwright I've studied who wanted an audience in some way. He was a singer as a teenager. He sang for a while. He read books on hypnotism. He wanted somehow to he was looking for some way of controlling people or something like that. But he had a gift, his real gift, as you mentioned when you said you know him, how light he was. He had a gift for mimicry. He had a good ear. He could tell a good joke. And he had a sense that he was a writer when he wrote a parody for a local amateur radio show. And the guy asked to see it. And he never heard from him again, except when he was listening to the radio, he heard his little parody done by a professional comedian. So they stole his work. And all of that's brewing as he's floundering through school. And essentially, he had to wait. He we call it in England blogged. He was rejected twice by the University of Michigan. And
But John, you're jumping ahead because
sorry, John, then stop me and put me in place, Johnny.
the thing is where we were. I mean, we left this, this rich kid, this young prince, living, whose father it could be asked for $50,000, and then the Depression came, and that seems to be the central fact in Arthur's life that made him
Absolutely.
From the governing class in the sense I was thinking of him as the working man. As a working man.
Well, it was an extraordinary trauma. The family, Freud calls trauma helplessness. I mean, essentially, that's what it is, a sense of complete helplessness, and it's what grew Miller up. He suddenly saw people around him, everyone around him, completely unmoored. The capitalism seemed to have disappeared. There were no checks. There was nothing. People were simply lost. And within 2 or 3 years, that posh upbringing was reduced to they moved to Brooklyn to be near relatives. And it was a sort of progression of smaller dwellings. And around that time, when he was 14 or 15, he started to learn about Marxism and question the system. Essentially, what flummoxed him was that there was no leadership in the country, but there was also in his family no leadership from his father. His father sort of just took to his bed and slept a lot.
Did the firm, did the rag, did it shut down?
Yeah, I mean, he lost it because the market was so hot, and when people were making so much money, he put a lot of his money and gambled and lost, and of course that created great acrimony in the family, and he dramatizes this. I don't know if it's true, but I'm prepared to believe it's true because he put it in American Clock. When he told Gussie that he'd lost all his money, she vomited. It was completely, it completely reduced them and changed them. And from Miller thought that the Depression was a moral tragedy as well as an economic one, because
say more about that.
People lost all hope or lost all expectations. Lives were destinies were completely irreversibly reversed, and Miller's was to a great degree, and that trauma never left him. A lot of my friends, even we know that this is behavior of a lot of older people who lived through the Depression, but Miller, even as rich as Miller became, he was really tight. He really watched those nickels and was a hard bargainer. I mean, money and the sense, even his drive to fame in The Price, he has a fascinating line which is a completely autobiographical play about the argument between him and his brother, which I'll get to. In The Price, the character that is Miller's simulacrum talks about is an architect talking about his drive to succeed, and he says, I didn't want to be like my father, who lost everything in the Depression. I didn't want to be vulnerable. I wanted I just didn't want that. I wanted to be in a place where I was, I couldn't be touched like that. And it's interesting that he couldn't be wiped out. So that the trauma. There was another trauma I argue in the book clearly. The other trauma, there were two. This is the trauma, which goes through everything, and he writes about endlessly. And as he writes about his father in almost all his major plays. But the other trauma, of course, which we'll get to, is Marilyn, which he never got over.
Well, let's not rush ahead because I'm still curious right now what the effect of Kermit, the star of the family, what was the effect of Kermit on him?
Great question. It was a huge effect, but Kermit was a communist. Kermit belonged, he was a card-carrying communist. Arthur certainly flirted with people that held those beliefs, but he was never anywhere like, he was just a radical. But Kermit was an idealist and big-hearted, a really honorable person. And
because it seems as if he is the unsung hero of Arthur's life, he made Arthur's life.
Well, in a way, certainly he's the linchpin of a lot of Arthur's behavior, because when the Depression came, he was in. This is where the argument between the brothers comes. He was already at NYU, going to university when the Depression came. And when Arthur got into Michigan, they made a deal. And the deal was Arthur should go. Kermit was working for the father, trying to keep the business alive, and he committed to sort of doing that. And the deal was that Arthur should go for a year, then Arthur should come back and work with the father, and so that Kermit could continue his education, and then they would sort of spell each other, and that way, together they would get their education.
So the firm was still gasping along.
Yes, it was. In the end, he lost it, but it was completely reduced. Completely reduced. And what happened was, in his sophomore year, Arthur wrote a play that won the big writing prize that came.
Well,
What?
But isn't that one of the reasons why he went to Michigan, because they had a playwright?
Correct. He went there because he read, but he read that they gave these prizes, the Hopwood Award for writing, but he hadn't written anything. It was just he read that and he thought, oh, that'd be good. Maybe I could write something and compete for that and get that.
And that's why he went to Michigan. Yeah,
right. And we'll get to the play in a minute. But what happened was, once Arthur had written that play, and he had signed on in Michigan to study journalism, not creative writing or anything like that. And after the play, he switched majors, and he suddenly saw himself as a playwright. And
well, I was fascinated because his teacher was Kenneth Rowe.
That's correct.
And the first book, I can still remember buying the book when I was in my early teens, write that play. And
you read that book. Good for you. Huh? You read the book.
Yes, I read when I was a kid. It made a huge impression on me, because this was the foolproof way of how to write a play. And even then, I must say, I didn't like the book because it was too formulaic. It was all based on Ibsen, and there was a formula to writing a play.
Right.
And I remember being disappointed in that book, because I just said, well, if this is telling me what to do and I don't want to do it, what does that mean?
Well, Kenneth Rowe, what he did was he believed in Miller. But he believed Miller's idea of himself from the beginning. I mean, Miller obviously had some skill in writing, because another English teacher had suggested to him that he become a critic. and Miller figured, well, that would just take too long. He in his mind, he was gonna, now he'd written a play that had won an award, he was just gonna write a couple of more and go right to Broadway.
And he won, what was it, $250 he won?
More, I think it was that original, I think it might have even been slightly more, but I think 250 or 500, enough to pay for the next year of education. And so what happened was Kermit said, "You're doing good. You don't you keep going." And so in a sense, the issue which the price and Joan, his sister, says is exactly the argument between them. Miller flunked helping the father. He never came back. He pursued his own self-interest, which is a big theme in his plays: self-interest, pragmatism versus social responsibility. And as a consequence, the Kermit, who was the academic high flyer and who wanted to be a writer, he also wanted to be a writer. His life was in some sort of indentured servitude to his father, which he never finished college. He stayed with his father until the war came, and he went to war and became a war hero, and fought in the Battle of Bulge. And there was always between them Miller felt, I think, shamed by Kermit's goodness.
Because Kermit, what impressed me about your book was I hadn't realized the depth of the love that Kermit had for his brother. That sort of astonished me.
Yeah, well,
it was a deep love. It wasn't.
Yeah, that's true, and he encouraged him to go for it. I mean, but he was to a certain extent, I think he sacrificed himself to the family. And there's a hitch to that, which comes into All My Sons. The hitch to that is that the father and mother lied to their sons about how much money they had.
Well, that was an astonishing detail that I'd never heard before. That they had not lost all their money.
No, they'd lost a substantial amount, but they had enough to get by. But they wanted the children in the business. They wanted to, and so that the issue of the family lie, the lie that is going to keep the family together, but in a sense sacrifices self-pragmatism trumps social responsibility, is what is underneath the argument in All My Sons. So that theme is released and admitted. The thing about the Millers as a family is that like in All My Sons, they repressed everything. They kept the surface harmony going. You couldn't just, they didn't yell and scream at each other. Any disappointments, generally speaking, were obliquely expressed. Although it's true that Gussie certainly, I mean, Miller is like Tennessee Williams, a sort of co-production, because Gussie sort of put all her disappointments into, once Arthur found his way to writing, all her cultural disappointments, the fact that she wouldn't ever meet the people she'd hoped to meet, that she wouldn't go to the concerts she hoped to go to, all of that disappointment was transformed into a kind of ambition whispering, which Miller, to the end of his days, in Time Bends, he talks about how he had never really properly resolved his relationship with his mother, because on the one hand, it was oppressive, and he paid, I mean, Miller, indeed, as you know and as I know, if you're crazy enough to want to be a writer, you pay a price for a big emotional price for this sort of fanatic commitment to an idea of yourself as this thing. And Miller did pay an enormous price for his success, I think.
Well, let's move on with this because I want about his life. Talk about he graduates uh from uh from Michigan
Gets
with
married.
a wife
Yeah.
and comes to New York to become a writer.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen for 9 years. He writes. Part of the issue is the anti-Semitic climate of New York, and the Broadway isn't taking Jewish plays, and aren't and with even Odets, who did do Wake and Sing, in subsequent plays, uh, de de-Jewished them in a way, and so there's that, and he just couldn't find his way, and he made a living writing radio plays, which was easy for him, and
Well, one thing I just wanted, one detail that really struck me is that the Theater Guild Award gave prizes for new plays, and the other winner, and which Arthur won, and the other winner was Tennessee Williams.
yeah,
So that's the first time that they connect.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And it's the two forms of of American theater, Ibsenesque naturalism and the Chekhovian free associative poetic theater.
Right. Well, the beginning there, and of course, Miller was out of. I mean, that's sort of interesting because Miller sort of broke with that, or try. I mean, I think was trying to break out of what the Ibsenesque thing with Death of a Salesman, and even trying to sort of get an expressionistic element into the plays after the success of All My Sons. But it took him. He actually decided what a play called The Man Who Had All the Luck had a terrible short-lived Broadway run, and it was such a failure that he said that was it. He'd spent 8 or 9 years trying to write
and was his wife Mary supporting them and their children?
Oh yes, after she worked as an editor, and was a great support, and she's a Catholic, a lapsed Catholic, radical herself, very ideological, very black and white, but a zealot, but
and believed in him.
Absolutely, completely believed in him. And Miller was the dreamy one. She was much more he called her the rock. She was solid, and that belief, again, it's a substitute for the all-defining eyes of the mother. She really backed him, and she on their first date ever, he asked her to go to the movies, and he didn't have any money to take her, and she suggested going to the movies. He didn't have any money, so she paid for him, and that sort of set the model of what happened.
The detail that knocked me out is the week after their marriage, he goes to sea as a merchant seaman, trying to get experience to put into it, have something to write about.
Absolutely.
I thought that was
that gets to the idea, and you see, I know exactly. I mean, I'm afraid it's a little too close to my bone when I was that age. But I mean, his wife was, and was happy to be for a while, a sounding board. But he was really working hard to be a writer. I mean, really hard graft, and getting. He got a good agent. He was getting some sense that he had a talent and it could work, but it wasn't working.
Well, we've just got a warning from Sydney, so we've got to. I love this talk, but we've got to keep. How did he meet the first big? I mean, Elia Kazan. How do they connect?
Well, because Kazan directed All My Sons.
No, but how had they met?
It was he took All My Sons to his agent, and the agent, who was a famous agent, Leland Hayward, didn't respond, and he came down and he said, "I want to take all my plays back now." And Hayward said, "Give me 24 hours." And what he did was he got a woman called Kay Brown, who was the woman who found Gone with the Wind for David O. Selznick. She took him on, and she sent the plays to Harold Clurman and Kazan had started a production company. And to Miller, Odets was the man during his apprenticeship at Michigan. He was the star of the Broadway theater, but he was political and lyrical and rebellious. And Clurman was the person who he thought was God, quote unquote. And he didn't know Kazan, but Kazan was making a movie called Boomerang. And because Clurman thought the script was for him to direct, because he directed Odets in the 30s. But Kazan invited Miller onto the set of Boomerang and gave him a walk-on, and that was it. I mean, he saw how Kazan worked, and all the people that were in that film are the people who ended up in All My Sons. And Kazan I met Kazan. I was good friends with Clurman, who was my mentor. But Kazan, even in his old age, was incredibly charismatic and powerful as a person, strong. And he had a really strong intuitive sense of personality and psychology. And he and Miller shared a similar lives. They had adoring mothers, fathers who were businessmen who wanted them to stay in business and didn't believe in the arts. They were left wing, and they both had marriages that were shaky. So they had a lot to share, and they became within 2 years. Really, I think Miller says this. I think until they broke over the House Un-American Activities Committee, Kazan was Miller's closest friend. Miller didn't have a lot of friends. He was working too hard and writing, and he was married. He had friends, but they were not many homies, as they say. So that's how they met. And Kazan did a great job on that play, and so good did he do on All My Sons that Tennessee Williams saw that play twice and offered Streetcar to Kazan on the basis of the direction that he'd given to All My Sons.
It's so fascinating about in Kazan's notebooks about the way he explores both All My Sons and Streetcar, and he talks about misunderstanding All My Sons, that the spine of the play was not the brother but the mother. Say more about that, and then we'll have to move on.
Well, I mean, yes, the brother is the hero of the plot, in the sense that he is the one who calls his father out. But the force underneath it, this is where Miller is truly brilliant. What you see, the mother insists on a lie that her son, who has been missing in action for 3 years, is coming home, and no one can say otherwise. She will not. She's the outward sign of benevolence and motherliness and neighborliness, but what she does, in fact, is incredibly aggressive. And what she's doing is actually making the mental space of the play useless. The mind is useless. You must obey her, or we can't go on. So to a certain extent, it really reflects, that to me is like voter fraud now. In other words, the landscape of denial becomes his subject.
I think you put it in the way you just said. He's depicting an America unhinged by fear, to use your word.
Absolutely.
Let's and so that becomes a hit, and then he goes on to we have to move on to Death of a Salesman, which
the thing that gave him the courage to write that play was that he wrote, before he wrote that play, he wrote the first novel ever written about anti-Semitism in America, called Focus. It's not a great novel. It precedes Gentleman's Agreement by about 18 months. And that's,
You know what I was fascinated by that the week after All My Sons opened, he got a job in a box factory.
well, but just for a week.
Only for okay.
Yeah, just for a week. He was a Broadway playwright making $2,000 a week. He was not going to deny that.
And then we got, and he built the house. He up in Roxbury. He built his own cabin, built a house from a little shack from a writing shack, and then went in it and wrote.
Well, I was with him. That's where I met him twice. I met him once at Clermont's deathbed, and then once, and then again. And he took me to. This was fascinating. He took me to the place that he built. And first of all, he brought Inga, his third wife, who had never been there. She'd
Really?
never been there. It was a mile and a half from where they lived. She'd never seen it. But the thing that amazed me was he built the cabin, put the roof on, got it up, went in. The tools were still in the corner of the cabin, and he sat down and he wrote the first act of Death of a Salesman in 8 hours. He just wrote and wrote and wrote, crying, laughing, stopped for a little dinner, came back, wrote some more, and then it took him another month to write the second act.
Oh,
But
I didn't realize
it was like a brainstorm. In other
Yes.
words, he called it out of himself. I mean, I've heard that. Well, look, it happened to you with 6 Degrees.
Yes.
Where it just comes and you just follow the characters, you follow behind them. It flows.
But then, and he gave it to Kazan right away, and Kazan brought it to Joe Milzner, who made it an expressionistic play.
Yeah, brilliant. And the fact that the frame of the house is so marginal, so minimal.
Is it still there?
Metaphor for the actual family too, because one of the things I think that Miller is trying to say, he certainly says it, screams it in the Price, is that his family was fraudulent. That it was Augusta used to say, I was sold like a cow to my husband, but it was a deal. It was a financial arrangement, and I think he felt that there was not much love there. It's interesting to hear him.
And
say
there wasn't much love in his own marriage. To Arthur and Mary.
No, but one of the most fascinating things to me, probably the most fascinating thing to me, was Ross Miller gave me a letter.
That's Kermit's son.
Yes, that's right. That had been sent to Kermit and to Mr. and Mrs. Miller, telling them that he was in love with Marilyn and was going to marry her. And in that letter, which I have right here, he says he is absolutely straightforward about what his marriage was like. And it's not like what he says in Time Beds. It's much, much worse. He essentially was banished from the marital bed for a long time. And he says to his parents, for me, Mary was a vindictive, punishing woman. I was not overstating things when I told you that had I not made this break and left her, I would have sought another way than writing to make a living. I cannot write when I am full of hate and surrounded by hate. And he called his marriage, he said, my home was a tomb. Now,
this is the mystery.
That is an intensity and an impoverishment that doesn't ever come through in the that he would never have admitted in life. But he admitted to his parents.
Well, I don't understand. I mean, Kazan introduces him to Marilyn Monroe Arthur knows that she's sort of Kazan's girl, and yet he becomes overwhelmed by her. Why does he feel so guilty about his romance with Marilyn, who's crazy about him, that he goes back to Mary to try to reinvigorate the marriage? Well, that's the one part that
he has two kids. He's loyal. I mean, Miller was very heavily invested in being good and being perceived to be good. He was trying to make his marriage work. But can I just read you, John, what she says and what he says about Marilyn? Because this is very interesting. It says to his parents, I met her in Hollywood in 1951, was never alone with her for 5 minutes, actually, although Mary never believed this and is incapable of believing it. But it is the truth. She was unknown then, having appeared in a few pictures, but not as a star. I certainly had never heard of her. To everyone else, apparently, she was the sexy dame. To me, she had a face bathed in tears, was scared to death, and could barely talk above a whisper. For reasons I have never understood, I told her that what I thought, which was that she would be a great star. There was no one who would have laughed at me then. We shall see soon whether I was right. Now, I saw her 3 or 4 times in Hollywood over a period of 3 days, but never alone, right? I was trying to make my marriage work then, and I had no hope, really, but I was bound to try. In the years from 1951 until I met her last April in 1955, I did not see or hear from her. Anyway, the point is that he had, and he says this in the letter, he had almost no time with her. She was making bus stops. She was about to start her own production.
No. Bus stop is way down the line.
No, it's not.
Oh, in 55 when he meets.
Yeah.
Oh,
He doesn't see her. He writes her only 2 letters. I wrote her only 2 letters, and then she went and married. In the years from 15 until last April, I did not hear or see or hear from her. She tried to make a life with DiMaggio, but he turned out to be a cruel and stupid man, and she left him after a few months, etc.
The thing that I saw just a couple of weeks ago on TCM, there was a Marilyn Monroe movie, an early Marilyn Monroe movie called "Don't Bother to Knock."
Wonderful.
I love that. I remember seeing it as a kid and being very disturbed by it, because Marilyn, whom I'd just seen I knew she was the pinup, and I went to see it because that you saw she played an insane babysitter, and you looked at this beautiful, the madness in her eyes and the lostness in her eyes. If Arthur Miller must have seen that movie, anybody who saw that movie would want to run the opposite direction from Marilyn Monroe, no matter how beautiful she was.
Except you know, he couldn't save his father. He couldn't save his mother, but he couldn't repair them. He could be an angel of repair for her, and she could be an angel of repair for him, because Miller was blocked. He was not writing at all well. He was dead inside, internally, and she was the promise of new life and vitality for him. And as Kazan always said, that Marilyn went for the drug of reassurance. And she was reassurance for him that A, she was not stupid, and B, that he was this great writer who was going to write her a great part that was going to show the world that she was the actress that she wanted to be, or thought herself to be, or was aspiring to be. And that effort, that endeavor, was the Misfits. That he tried to make good on that promise, which was which was meant to be a gift, but ended in being an epitaph to their relationship.
It says, right, we just got, Sydney has given us some questions from the audience. A woman wants to know, what role does Judaism play in Miller's life?
Actually, not much in any sort of rigorous formal
Because
way.
Mary was Irish Catholic.
You know,
And
in Harlem, there were 200. He didn't know any Gentiles at all growing up. Very, I mean, there were two in Harlem. New York City had 14% of all the Jews in America, and Harlem had 200,000.
but did
So
he have a bar mitzvah? I mean,
yeah,
did he?
he had a bar mitzvah. But he says in Time Bends that he was not dreaming of the Talmud, but being a Roy Rogers, I mean, being a sort of cowboy hero and being an adventurer. And he didn't have much of that. He did write. It doesn't come much into his plays, but he does say that part of his moral rigor and part of the in the Crucible, part of the way the Puritans argued the religious issues echoed his Jewish upbringing. But
Well, it's funny because Kazan in his book A Life calls Arthur a Puritan.
Yes, that would be right.
I'm so fascinated that he wrote The Crucible after his affair began with Marilyn, coming back to Mary, and he dedicates The Crucible to Mary, this woman who's keeping.
And it's a sort of an apology. And it's definite. Abigail is definitely a stand-in for Marilyn.
Well, that's the fact to read. Yeah, I mean,
I have written it down here. One of the cut lines from the play. She says, if your wife had what I have under my skirt, he cut that line, but it was very much a daydream of repair where she admits her coldness forced him to stray, and he gets his goodness back, or his reputation for goodness, his name back, and in his sacrifice of himself. So it all plays into this sort of interesting guilt-ridden, repressed quality that Miller had. Miller said he had the synapses of a banker. And there is that element to him.
John, we have a question here. Please say more about why you chose essentially to end the biography with The Price in 1968. You discuss After the Fall and The Price, but skip Incident at Vichy entirely, which Miller also wrote at this time. Please say more about why you made that decision.
Well, the thing about it's a strictly structural thing, because the job description of the Jewish Lives books is that it has to be 65,000 words. So you have a limit, and if I'm as critic, I know people enjoy Incident at Vichy. It's a good evening, but it's not, you have to eliminate. He wrote so many plays. You have to try to show the major plays and show the major themes. And Incident Vichy didn't have and doesn't have much of a life in the culture, where these other plays both express deeply his own internal world and also had a great, powerful influence in the culture.
Interesting. Could you imagine writing a second? Is it worth a second volume?
A second volume of Miller?
Could you ever imagine writing a volume and as you did with Williams, you took the part of his life after Glass Menagerie. Could you imagine writing a book about Miller that would tackle go in depth After the Fall, The Price, and all the plays like Broken Glass that he wrote at the end of his life?
I think I would have difficulty with that. I think probably not. I think I found as hectic and unboundaried as Williams was, he was on some sort of spiritual journey. He was trying to resolve not only his psychological problems in writing, as any writer does, but or just contend with them or admit them. But his writing, for me, has much more resonance because it's lyrical and it's beautifully phrased. Not that Miller's isn't, but it's a different kind of writing. And his collapse was he sort of collapsed into sort of almost meaninglessness in his search for. But somehow I found that more tragic and interesting to look at as a biographer. With Miller, it's tidier in a way, and he continued to write and have a very good life. And he was more or less, if you can use this word for anyone, normal. I think he was very lucky in his third wife, because
our last question is, I remember once they were leaving the next day, and our friend, somebody said, "Will you have a good time in Europe?" And all this, yeah. And Ingrid said, "Oh," she said, "We're having a nice time now. And the minute we get off the plane for the next 2 months, it'll be Marilyn, 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 Marilyn." That's all anybody wants to know. What is the most surprise? Our last question is, what's the most surprising thing that you learned about Miller in the course of writing this book?
For me, this whole thing about Marilyn Monroe is that he made a rookie mistake. He married someone he did not know, and the marriage was more or less over the minute she says, he had an idea of me and I could always be that idea, but he'd never seen her act on a soundstage. And she behaved so badly when he got to England with her to make Prince and the Showgirl, that he was really shocked. And he left, and this is always an interesting issue. It was an issue for Williams, it was an issue for Orton. He left his diary open, or notebook open, and she saw an entry in which he said, I think I made a mistake. I mean, her behavior is, and Marilyn, for her part, said that Arthur couldn't believe it when the monster surfaced. That her terror, if you look at her background, which was just beyond appalling, her terror, she talks of a fear beyond terror, and a lot of the behavior, I mean, if you've ever lived with or encountered that, which I have, it's indigestible. It's incomprehensible. You don't know where it's coming from, and it's beyond awful.
Well, the irony is that the great script that he writes for her treats her as a sex object. I mean, the big scene is focusing in on her rear end as she plays paddleball. And
that wasn't, he didn't write that. That was an improvised little moment. And actually, it's a good moment.
It's wonderful in the moment, but it's not what Marilyn was hoping to show.
No, I mean, that is a fascinating issue, because if you can bear it, John, and if I have time, he tried to get Billy Wilder to do the Misfits. And he wrote to Billy Wilder about how he was going to expand the character of Gay, who is the Clark Gable figure. And he says to Wilder about this guy, the solution for him is to assert his skill, his craft as well, to earn money on his own instead of living on hers. He conceives the Mustang hunt to win her back, to dominate her, to bedazzle her, to assert his strength before her again, and thus to conquer and dispel her uneasiness and its threat of dismissal from him. So in other words, the Mustang hunt is the script. He was trying to show his prowess to win her back. But the minute she left the set for the last shot, that was it. She never saw him again. And she was raised cruelly, and she had a great deal of cruelty in her. And Kazan called it, as you read in his life. I mean, he said that he was really, Arthur was way in above his head and didn't understand what he was
John,
doing.
thank you. I wish we could. We've run out of time, and I wish we could talk about this for a few more hours. Thank you so much, John.
I enjoyed it.
Sydney, will you give the closing remarks?
Yes. Well, I want to say thank you to both of you as well. I could also listen to this discussion for hours and hours. So maybe we'll have to have a sequel at some point.
Okay, by me.
Great.